What is the history of today's diversity policies? The word diversity was not selected at random. It has a purpose. The purpose of the policy of diversity was to divert resources, attention, opportunities, and population power away from Black Americans. Today's diversity policies are simply the old anti-Black policies wearing a new set of clothes. The primary goal of the diversity policy, after redirecting resources from Blacks, is to obliterate the unique role Blacks played in the development of this nation and to give a mythological impression that all groups contributed equally to the development of this nation. Nothing could be further from the truth. The diversity concept is designed to keep Blacks powerless and impoverished, obscure the social construct that socioeconomically cripples Blacks, and then give rights, resources, and protections earned by Blacks to newly fabricated and cobbled together minority groups. The concept of diversity was first introduced into American society centuries ago in the slave codes of 1705. The diversity provision in the slave codes was a method to maintain racial balance in numbers and to monitor Blacks when they aggregated. Diversity procedures regulated the number of Blacks who could gather at one time and kept them under surveillance so that whites could be alerted to and avert any efforts which might ignite insurrections. To effectively manage large Black populations in the South, the Diversity Act mandated that a slaveholder must have at least one white person to control and monitor every 4 Black slaves brought into the colonies. The slave-to-white ratio was difficult to keep in the mid-1700s because England, the chief slave trading nation, wanted to have as many slaves as possible in the colonies in order to produce as much commercial product for England as possible. To prevent or reduce the possibility of Blacks and Native Indians forming a coalition to drive whites back to Europe, when the Black slave population reached nearly 40% in 1750, white colonial planters requested the British government do 2 things. 1, reduce the number of slaves being shipped into the southern colonies, and 2, send more Europeans to be in the management class in the South, but in the North to do the reverse, to import 4 whites for every Black so the nation's majority population would remain white. Colonists in the South wanted to prevent slaves from escaping to nearby Florida, which was Spanish territory and where the slaves would be free Spanish citizens upon arrival. The colonists therefore established a new colony, Georgia, as a buffer between South Carolina and the Spanish territory of Florida. A primary purpose of the Georgia buffer zone was to impede Black slave runaways from escaping South Carolina plantations and migrating to slave sanctuaries in Spanish Florida. To secure the buffer colony and to maintain the required ratio of Blacks to whites, more white bodies were needed. To meet that demand, colonial powers convinced the British government to empty its prisons, poorhouses, and insane asylums and ship large numbers of white immigrants to settle in the newly established colony of Georgia. Meanwhile, the Spanish government and the Catholic Church continued to encourage slaves to come to Florida. Hundreds of slaves successfully escaped into Spanish Florida, where they were granted land and became settlers and free citizens. The Catholic Church, the official church of Spain, and the power source behind the Spanish crown typically assisted the escaped slaves to establish themselves in the new country. The 1705 Diversity Act included a provision that required white males to be members of the local militia, to bear arms, and to perform slave monitoring duties. All communities had to have plantation police or paddy rollers to monitor the movement of slaves and to patrol for runaway slaves. The diversity provision that required whites to be the dominant population and possess arms to control and monitor slaves was the foundation for the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and a tool to establish and maintain a country for a free white population that controlled everything. White population domination was the stated national goal, but the reality was quite different. The North had limited use for slaves. In the South, Plantation owners needed black slaves for labor, and blacks were the dominant population in many of the colonies. When the diversity policy was first initiated in 1705, the slave population was nearly 40% nationally and over 50% in the southern states, and was continuing to grow. The North saw expansion of the black population as a threat. Southern plantation owners could not achieve a majority white population because cheap white labor could not compete with free black labor, and white immigrants did not want to migrate into the South and Southern culture. As a practical matter, the plantation owners accepted large black populations, but devised cruel physical and psychological control measures that were so horrific and brutal that the slaves endured intense fear, pain, anxiety, and continuous terror. They were not permitted to be human. Some died from their experiences, but most gave in to the conditioning and did not revolt. The slave owners took these measures to protect themselves and to control the majority. By the time the Civil War began in 1861, states like South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia had black populations that were approaching the 50% mark. The Diversity Act that required white men to carry weapons and to monitor slaves led to the Second Amendment that was included as a requirement in the U.S. Constitution. Today, 160 years after the American Civil War ended, the diversity concept in race matters has again reared its head. Just like in previous centuries, present-day diversity policies devalue blacks and equate every newly fabricated minority to the historical struggles of black Americans. In 1978, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in favor of Alan Bakke accelerated the shift from black to diversity. Bakke was a white medical student who claimed that preferences given to blacks were the underlying cause of his rejection from medical school, and that those pretenses amounted to discrimination against him. A minority opinion stated there was no constitutional justification for preferential treatment for any group other than black Americans, but the majority sided with Bakke. Public and private policymakers responded. They adopted the language of civil rights, but applied it to diversity, which only nominally included blacks, and in reality benefited groups more acceptable to the public, groups that did not conjure up uncomfortable images of slavery, segregation, or black power. White policymakers knew that the shift away from corrective preferential treatment for blacks to generalized diversity would be detrimental to blacks. The policy shift of unearned entitlement to groupings of diverse people was made behind closed doors, deemed politically correct, then announced to the public. Liberals felt that growing opposition from whites would impede any corrective actions for blacks. So, liberals switched gears and eagerly embraced diversity for any certified new minorities as the new national civil rights goal. Black civil rights leaders who sensed they were politically powerless and had gone as far as they could go followed liberals by embracing diversity and political correctness that made blacks invisible. Having knowingly sold out their people, the civil rights establishment kept silent and promoted the newly fabricated minority classes with the hope that some blacks might inadvertently benefit through diversity, inclusion programs, and political correctness attitudes, which were popular in mainstream society. Both government and the private sector accepted the legal diversity rationale with the clear understanding that blacks would be nearly excluded from preferential treatment and public resources diverted to the newly fabricated minorities. The federal government's failure to enforce the nation's immigration laws enabled a massive influx of legal and illegal Hispanic immigrants to enter the United States. They soon surpassed the native black population and became the majority minority and the nation's preferred minority in terms of receiving benefits and privileges. By the year 2000, such large numbers of Hispanics had entered the country that they displaced blacks in population, and from the nation's consciousness, blacks moved down from second-class to third-class citizens. The reduction of blacks to third-class citizens gave Hispanics greater political leverage than blacks in voting potential, business development, and the public consciousness. The preferential immigration policies that sparked the growth of Hispanics were in response to the gains blacks made during the civil rights era. By 2014, there were 55 million Hispanics in the U.S., making up more than 17% of the population. 93% of Hispanics had been in the country less than 40 years. Since the year 2000, Hispanic organizations, authors, and media personalities publicly boast that they have made blacks obsolete, replaced them as the majority, and made them instead the minority. Adhering to a trickle-down belief, Hispanics argue that blacks have had their day. The diversity concept, as a public policy, offers a menu of preferred gender or ethnic groups from which the white overclass can choose to direct resources and opportunities. Diversity is a broad and ambiguous concept, which hides from public view who actually receives the targeted benefits. Traditional politicians and policymakers embraced diversity and put a screeching halt to the efforts that were just beginning to be put in place to correct some of the governmental actions that had excluded blacks from the economics of the U.S. for 360 years. Diversity policies became a facade for covering up the abuse inflicted on blacks by the U.S. government. Each class group that receives gratuitous special treatment further dilutes and redirects resources away from blacks. It is a continuous assault. An example of the way groups are gratuitously added to diversity without connection to American history is the proposal by President Barack Obama in October 2016, his final year in office, to add Middle Eastern people as a new racial category for the census and public policy. This would be the biggest realignment of federal definitions of race in decades and would further lock Native blacks into the lowest level of the nation's rank order of social acceptability. Amazingly, 50 years after the massive influx of immigrants began to displace Native Black Americans, Black elected officials and civil rights leaders remain committed to open-door immigration and diversity, even though those policies are injurious to members of their own race. Liberals argue altruistically that diversity and recognition of gender, language, and ethnic groups is good for the nation. Liberals found practically no resistance when they abandoned Black Americans, whose suffering was out of vogue, and eagerly jumped on the bandwagon of diversity. After decades of refocusing the nation's attention away from blacks to preferential treatment and affirmative action for diversity, the nation can easily point to the accomplishments achieved by women, Hispanics, Asians, LGBTs, Arabs, and the handicapped in the corporate boardrooms, contract offices, college classrooms, and government jobs. The gains of blacks in those categories, however, are minuscule. They are on the bottom, and over the past 50 years, those gains have mostly evaporated. Black people, replaced by diversity, remain excluded, abandoned, and quiet. Trump was unique to acknowledge the needs of Black people